Hey, Cypher here with another podcast. This time I want to talk about something that's been going on in the news quite recently, and quite a bit for a long time now in America, and it has a lot of historical connotations. Everyone is aware we've had a lot of recent massacres. And people have been looking at Australia as an example for what America could do to stymie the whole trend of American gun violence.
We know that other countries, in response to one mass shooting, have been able to craft laws that almost eliminate mass shootings. Friends of ours, allies of ours, Great Britain, Australia, countries like ours.
So I want to take a look at its effectiveness. And I've actually gone out and done quite a bit of research on this particular question, since Australia is always used as the primary example of what America could do. Now, I'm not going to go into whether or not it's right for America to do that, or even if it's constitutional. I'll put a link in the description to videos that are pertinent to that. I've actually done videos on that particular subject, and anybody who thinks that there isn't gun control already in America is just fooling themselves. We have had gun control since the 1930s, and it's pretty well established. But I'm not going to go into that. I'm more concerned about how well Australia's gun control actually applies to America, and whether or not it actually had any good effect for Australia. And I can tell you right out, it actually has had a positive effect, at least according to most experts. You have to understand, there has been a lot of debate on this, and I'm not just talking about stupid politicians making stupid political points, I'm talking about legitimate scholarship on this. Because, in reality, it's the scholarship that matters. So back in 1996, a gunman in Port Arthur, Tasmania, which is a state in Australia, went and killed 35 people, and 23 people were wounded as well. And it is one of the worst massacres in Australia's history. Quickly after that, Australia rallied around a gun control measure. And what they did is institute a ban on all semi-automatic rifles and automatic rifles, as well as shotguns, and then instituted mandatory buyback programs that would force people to go and sell their currently owned guns of those particular classes. And they actually managed to procure 600,000 guns. And that's just freaking huge, especially considering Australia only had about 18 million residents. Now think about that. They only had 18 million residents and they were able to procure 600,000 guns over the course of a couple of years. That's incredible. Now, mass shootings were obviously the thing that this law was trying to stop. And actually, it's gone off splendidly. There's been barely any mass shootings in Australia since the Gun Control Act. The decade after it, there were basically no shootings that killed more than 3 people. And the decade prior, there were 11. So there's a very clear before and after in terms of mass shootings on this particular thing. Now, crime is a different matter. You see, there has been a downward trend since around the early 90s in terms of violent crime. Not only in Australia, actually, but pretty much the entire Western world. We've even seen that here in America. And I made an episode on that, so I'll put a link somewhere. So there has been significant debate over whether or not this Gun Control Act has reduced the amount of violent crime, or whether or not it was just this downward trend that the entire Western world has experienced. Now, a number of studies say that the Australian Gun Control Act actually did make a significant difference, but there is significant argument against that fact. Of course, many of the studies that have argued against this were co-opted by gun advocacy groups and have been shown to have problems with their research methodology. But still, most of the ones that are saying that it has made a significant effect don't take into account the downward trend that was already being experienced by Australia at that point in time. So there is a bit of argument to be made in terms of whether or not it made a difference in terms of violent crime. But here's the other thing that nobody seems to be talking about in terms of Australia in relation to America. Australia is very, very small in population in comparison to America. It is 10 times less the amount of population that we have here. That's pretty significant in difference. Trying to legislate for 300 million as opposed to 30 million people is a very different prospect. Furthermore, I'm pretty sure that in America, if we tried to pass this, it would be counted as unconstitutional, at least according to the Supreme Court, and they're really the only ones who matter on this. But getting back to Australia, there's another thing that has been significantly studied in terms of the impact of gun control on the population and crime and whatnot, and that is suicides. Now, there has been a significant decrease in suicide by gun, but there's virtually no change in terms of the amount of suicide. And in recent years, there's actually been a significant uptick in suicide rates in Australia, actually in most of the Western world. Now, how much of that is counting towards the growth of population? I haven't really seen any studies on that, and I don't feel like doing this statistical analysis myself. But to sum it all up, Australia's gun laws have made a significant impact on mass shootings. At least most likely. Will it work for America? Probably not, since after all, it's unconstitutional here. But let's look at one thing that isn't really talked about in terms of the amount of mass shootings here. We have seen a significant increase in terms of mass shootings here, but we haven't actually seen a significant increase in comparison to the increase of population here. When accounted for by population growth, we've actually seen a decrease. Now, that's something that is really hard for people to get a grip on because we just keep on hearing about it in the news over and over and over again. But the fact is, our population has been growing significantly for quite a long time. And here's the ultimate thing in terms of trying to apply Australia's gun laws to our own. We have this thing in the Constitution called the Grandfather Clause. You cannot institute a buyback policy that's mandatory according to that. We could feasibly outlaw semi-automatic weapons or whatnot, but for everyone who currently owns a semi-automatic weapon, they would be legally able to continue owning it or even selling it on the open market because it is not illegal now. And nothing the US can do can change that. All these idiots who are afraid that Obama's going to come and take their guns don't really understand how the Constitution works because nobody can come and take that because of the Grandfather Clause. And we actually have a significant precedent for that. For instance, back in the 80s, Reagan actually passed a anti-machine gun legislation that makes it so that you can't buy machine guns anymore that were manufactured after that particular date. It's not illegal to own the ones that were made prior to that point because, well, they were made prior to that point, and the Grandfather Clause specifically states that you cannot make anything illegal retroactively. So, of course, Australia's gun law would never really be implementable here in the United States because we couldn't have mandatory gun buybacks. Did it work for them? Kind of, yeah. But not as significantly as the current political left would have you believe here in America. There's still significant gun ownership in Australia, and the potential for mass shootings is still there. They, of course, all took a great stand back in 1996 against that and made a significant difference. But we can't here, not in the same way.